Hey, hello everybody, and this is a big week in Parliament. It's the tabling of the midterm budget statement. So welcome to another catch up. I look forward to chatting to you. There's a lot that we can talk about. I have enjoyed studying the budget, looking at it, understanding what it means for you as a South African as one of the most important things that get happen. Let me tell you the honest truth. You know, as someone once famously said to me, talk is cheap, but money buys the whiskey. In this instance, it doesn't matter what we can say about GNU, about this or about that. At the end of the day, it's where the money goes that tells you what in fact is going to happen. Now, let me just say, of course, we're seeing some important developments that are taking place. Economy hopefully will begin to grow in the next number of years. That is an important thing. And secondly, as interest rates have come down and ultimately fuel prices have come down, it means you may have a little bit more money to spend in the economy. But that's not an exclusive growth strategy. It cannot be that we just increase consumer spending in the hope that along with that, more and more goods will be bought and therefore economy will grow. We've got to do a lot more important things. So I just thought it'd be important before I talk to you about the budget that I just give you some thoughts about why it's important to grow the economy. And for us, here's some key things that need to happen. One is we welcome the lights being on. Yeah, it's a good thing. It's a good thing that the lights are on. But it's not in and of itself enough because there's still too many citizens who are living with load reduction, which means their economic participation is relatively low. Second thing is, it's not just an infrastructure that underpins the growth of any economy. It's a fact that as you build energy, you've got to fix your logistics, and that's important that we fix Transnet. We've got to ensure that roads in fact work. We can't have bridges collapsing and all of that infrastructure breakdown. We've got to have a digital infrastructure. We've got to make data cheaper and more possible. And as I was even at the Vodacom Awards over the weekend, I hope you saw me dancing over there. But nonetheless, I want to even challenge telcos to make it possible that as we build broadband digital infrastructure, that it's cheaper for more citizens. So infrastructure growth has to be one of the key pillars that we focus on in the next while. The second thing is, how do we ensure that businesses and more people who are able to create jobs have that as an easier objective? And part of that work is about stimulating SMMEs. They are growth drivers in terms of creating jobs, making sure that we make sure townships are able to have special economic zones, which means that you reduce the tax burden on businesses in townships, but make sure they are job drivers. We've got to allow for a national civilian service that allows more young people into the workspace for a year, where you give them 6 months internship and 6 months work experience. And furthermore, you've got to make sure that big employers in whatever sector, particularly in agriculture, make it possible. Farmers can improve more opportunities for people to work, as we saw in the National Development Plan as one of the objectives. So more of that work has to be done to make sure in agriculture we do the best work we can, and in the township economy, and allowing that our industries are able to absorb more people who work. The third component is ultimately you've got to make sure that your people are skilled, because a child in South Africa isn't competing for a job only with a child in South Africa. They are competing for a job with someone else in the world. And I must withdraw the fact that I said child, because children shouldn't be working, but it's the young people in our country. It's the South African. So we've got to skill our children, make sure they get through skilled properly so that they can be productive adults. And part of that starts at birth, that we make sure that when we talk about a social safety net, that mothers who are pregnant do not go hungry, because children born hungry often have poor brain development, and naturally they end up in a space where they cannot fulfill their economic potential. We've got to make sure that ECD centers are operating well so that we can make sure that kids learn how to read and read for meaning. And we've got to make sure our primary schools work well. You see, that's a key foundational issue about making sure that you have a skilled pipeline so that our young people are able to become economically productive. And that's why I get so frustrated when we build poor schools. Man, that shows a lack of ambition. When we pass our kids at 30%, that says we have no dreams for our kids. We've got to make sure that they are the most skilled, they're studying in the most incredible infrastructure, and that we are building world-class facilities. And then lastly, let's keep our citizens safe, because in a not safe environment or an environment where crime is so rampant, it creates poor conditions for investment, and where your citizens are not healthy by having a poor healthcare system, you end up in a space where you cannot be economically competitive. Why I start with all of those things? Because those represent priorities. When we look at the midterm budget policy statement, on the other hand, you've got to appreciate that we're operating in a fiscally constrained environment. And there are just a few key things that I think the Minister of Finance needs to look at most crucially when we look at the midterm budget statement. If you don't fund those priorities, well, where is the money going to? South Africa has been growing at 1% for the last 10 years on average. So we've got to focus on growth if we can have more money to do other things. The difficulty is that this budget is going to reflect on all of us that actually we're going to fund more money towards debt. Because we've borrowed so much, it's a bit like if you are living in a house and your bond repayments are so much higher that you have no money to do other things. That's what South Africa is faced up to at the moment. We're spending too much money on debt. We're spending too much money on, in many ways, a bloated administration, which with an increased cabinet. We're also spending too much money on what is called welfare expenditure. And therefore, 60% of our budget goes towards welfare. A significant proportion of that goes towards debt. And so you can appreciate that we end up with very little room towards investing in infrastructure and infrastructure for growth. So my expectation is that actually a number of key things that the minister must do. One, if we are going to borrow or increase borrowing, let's borrow so we can fund infrastructure. Remember, I spoke to you about economic infrastructure. That is important. Don't borrow to pay for your day-to-day expenses. Borrow so that you can build something sustainable. You can't go take out a bond so that you can go shopping. You take out a bond for a house or a sustainable infrastructure. That's what we've got to focus on this midterm budget statement. And then the second thing is, you can't just keep funding programs that are not delivering outcomes. For example, I saw in certain instances, certain departments returning money. All of that is a problem when you face up to the fact that next year we run the risk of cutting down the number of teachers, education services that we've got. So I want to urge that along with the many cuts that we put forward, let's focus on investing in education. And I'm deeply passionate about this because if you're going to have a skilled workforce, you've got to be able to fund for education. And we've got to be able to direct expenditure towards that. And I'm hoping that the midterm budget statement hears that cry, because it is ultimately the cry of the poor. Wealthy South Africans are going to figure out a way to either increase their school fees and keep classroom sizes smaller and continue leveraging from big donor communities. Poor schools, quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools, or free schools, they face a heavy burden. That's why classrooms get past 70. That's where ultimately you face this difficulty where teacher-pupil ratio is increasing and the quality of education is compromised. So let's do everything we can to fund education. I also think that we've got to be able to say, rather than giving more and more VIP protection to politicians and giving more cabinet posts and all of that, why don't we fund the police? When we take that money and redirect it towards policing so that more citizens are protected. The ratio of police to citizen in this country is way too high, and in many communities in a way that the police cannot cope. So crime, extortion, all of these things that we talk about, the midterm budget statement must be able to demonstrate that we are directing money towards that, to make sure that citizens are safe. And then ultimately, let's make sure that our healthcare system isn't burdened by medical legal claims where ultimately scrupulous lawyers and people who work within the system and sometimes just overcapacitation delivers medical negligence. Scrupulous lawyers come on board. Sometimes in legitimate cases, people aren't even being able to get their own payouts because simply the healthcare system is under so much stress. So let's keep our citizens healthy, educated, and safe, so that whatever the budget priorities are, they focused on ultimately building infrastructure, making sure that more South Africa becomes this world-class place where we've got incredible infrastructure, great roads, and our budget must be directed towards that. Now, many people often ask me, where does more of the money come from? When I scan through the budget, I realized that even during COVID, we took money away from SETAs, certain SETAs that were underperforming, to fund particular projects. I would say let's focus on funding infrastructure, making sure education works. But the second thing is we've got to cut corruption. This weekend, I heard something that really, really disturbed me. A school was being built in Mpumalanga for just over 280 million rands. That project has to be abandoned. That is wasteful and fruitless expenditure. It is in fact a crime against the people of this country. And when I speak to the Auditor General, I get all of these reports about how many more departments are wasting money. This is woeful, unsustainable. Fellow South Africans, if we do anything in this budget, let's cut that nonsense. And I've encouraged the Auditor General to make sure that they issue what is called a certificate of debt, which means that those municipalities must be penalized. Those institutions must be penalized if they cannot, in essence, continue to produce results that work for the people of this country. We need to free up every rand and cent so that it works for you. That's the sole objective. And so eradicate corruption when it occurs, take away wasteful and fruitless expenditure, because all of these things have got financial consequences for all of us. The last thing I would want to say is let's focus on state-owned enterprises that are poor, that are not delivering things. For example, when I think about the South African Airways, I do think it's long overdue that we should have got an equity partner there so that we don't have to keep funding bailouts into an institution like SAA. And certainly we've got a lot of bailouts that are linked towards Eskom, which means that Eskom itself is will receive over the medium-term budget, had received over 240 billion rands to start. So we've got to be able to figure out how do we get municipalities to pay Eskom so that we, the state, the government, can use its money to prioritize citizens rather than bailing out Eskom continuously. And more of these state-owned enterprises are in the same place. Now we're looking at Post Office, we're looking at many others that are lining up for more bailouts from you and me, because effectively money that comes into the state comes from either your personal tax, your business tax, or other revenues such as debt or borrowings or other types of taxes that are accrued. But the majority of that is from citizens like you and me. So we can't be taxed double. We can't be paying tax on one level, or on another level being able to also being taxed high when it comes to the consumption of goods. And every South African is a taxpayer. I don't want to hear anyone say, no, only those who work. No, actually, everyone pays VAT, which means everyone is investing in this country, which means everybody deserves that the money in this country is spent to the right priorities. So this afternoon, the midterm budget policy statement comes up. I look forward to hearing what the Minister of Finance goes. Let me tell you the fun bit that happens after that is that in a few moments from now, I'll go into a lock-up session. I'll get to hear more about the budget. And then tomorrow we'll do a briefing, and then our committee will then be able to look at all the divisions that come from there so that I can look through it to make sure that every rand, every cent is spent on you. So I promise you, if I do anything in this budget in this next while, I'm going to champion you, the person, the South African, the person sitting at home. Because I know that more than anything, South Africans need work, they need to be safe, they need to be well educated, and they need to live in cities that are world class. We got to dream better as